Hey there, I'm author Sarah A. Chrisman,
And I'm Gabriel Chrisman.
and today we're going to talk about the life and works of Laura Ingalls Wilder and her daughter Rose Wilder Lane. So, the works that we're going to be discussing today, and hold them up as I say this, are what you could call the Wilder canon. So there are the Little House books. These are Laura's famous books. The Little House in the Big Woods, Little House on the Prairie, Farmer Boy, all of those, that whole series. And then there are the works of her daughter, Rose Wilder Lane, which is Freeland was her big one, and Let the Hurricane Roar, which was later republished under the title Young Pioneers. And then a couple biographies. So we've got Prairie Fires by Carolyn Fraser and The Ghost in the Little House by, who wrote this one? William Holtz. So, a lot of material that we're going to be covering today. But the funny thing about this is it's basically the same story, told over and over and over again.
Or at the very most, the same set of stories.
The same set of stories.
Yeah.
Right. So, one of the things about this, and in the two biographies that we held up, they go into depth on this. No one really knows how much of these stories Laura wrote and how much Rose wrote, because there was substantial editing going on, and they were writing back and forth. Rose was the one who actually had publishing creds. She was the one who'd worked for magazines and had things published. And then after she had established her own career, she told her mom, hey, I think you could make some money at this too. It was the 1930s, it was the Depression, everyone needed money. And she was just telling her mom, hey, I think you could make some money at this, why don't you give it a shot? And after that, there was so much back and forth that went on that these two biographers, the one who wrote The Ghost in the Little House, basically he felt that Rose was largely the driving force behind the Little House books that most of us read as kids. The author of Prairie Fires comes down a little more on Laura's side and says that they were basically her books, but even this author says that you really can't tell how much to credit to who, because it was just so melanged at that point. It was so mixed together. But the biographer who wrote The Ghost in the Little House actually went through the archives that are in the Wilder libraries, and he read Laura's original manuscripts, and he republished some of the pages from the original manuscripts at the end of this, along with the pages from the published version after Rose had had a go at it. And the ones that Laura had written herself before she had help, they really read like oral histories.
Yeah.
They read like, okay, and then we had this really hard winter, and we had the cow bred, and the calf came 9 months later. That's how Laura's original writings read. Whereas all of the dialogue, the lengthy descriptions, the fleshed out stuff, that's after Rose had gotten at it.
Though another thing to point out is that
Right.
a lot of the time these are billed as being nonfiction.
Right.
and that was a big part of their marketing early on, and then it became just sort of, they were sort of assumed to be nonfiction throughout
Right.
most of the 20th century.
But actually, when they first came out, they were very solidly identified as fiction.
Right.
That's how the publishers identified them. That's how Laura was referring to them at that time. Laura herself was referring to them as fiction.
Right.
She referred to them as fictional children's stories, even though she was using her own. And this is where it gets kind of funny and kind of sketchy from a writer's perspective, because she was she was admitting they were fictional stories, but she was using her own name and the names of all her families, and that's where it gets really mixed up.
She started to blur the line, and the fact is that then even the marketing worked out that it marketed better, it sold better, if they strongly implied that these were true.
Right. And so then they started to sort of shift their telling of the tale. That they went from freely admitting that these were complete fiction to saying, oh no, there's truth in them, to saying, oh, they're completely true. And by the end of Rose's life, Rose was actually threatening to take people to court who claimed that they were fiction, because she was saying, this is completely true, how dare you call my mother a liar, and she was threatening legal action against people.
But a lot of the stories, especially Little House in the Big Woods, is clearly the memories of Laura's mother, and not actually anything in her own lifetime.
Right, because some of the stories in here, they go back too far to be within Laura's lifetime.
They're telling stories of an America that didn't exist when she was alive.
Right. And the tales of, we made everything completely from scratch and we had absolutely no neighbors.
Yes.
That's an earlier part of America's history than Laura actually lived through.
Right.
So it's a lot of different stories interwoven together that were published in the 1930s and then became this American myth. And these were very impactful stories. I mean, I remember when I was a kid, we read these in school. Well, our teacher read some of them to us in school, and then we all rushed out to beg and plead our parents to get us the rest of them, basically.
Yes, and I read these early on as well.
Right.
These were very sort of foundational stories that told kids what it was like or what it was to be an American.
Right.
To a certain extent.
And they're very good at that. There are these stories of the myth of America and the myth of the freedom of America and the ideals of America. Now, Rose Wilder Lane, she actually was one of the founders of the libertarian movement. Yeah. So she was very strongly in the camp of America is freedom and she was independence, and actually she was so strong into this that throughout World War II, when she was living through World War II, she refused to get a ration card from the government. So she went through the entirety of World War II without sugar, without any store-bought milk, without any store-bought butter. All of these things, she was just subsisting on what she could scrape together on her own or by trading with other people, because she felt so strongly that ration cards were too socialist, too communist, and they were therefore un-American. Right. So she was very strongly into that. And so reading these books as an adult is a completely different experience from reading them as a child. Yes. If you haven't read these books since you were a kid, you should absolutely go back and reread them as an adult, because they will be you will have an entirely different perspective on them. And it's really interesting to read them knowing that aspect of Rose Wilder Lane's libertarianism and seeing how her politics got woven into these stories.
They were mostly her mother's oral history.
They were mostly her mother's oral history that she had a big hand in the publishing of. And again, they're very foundational works, and they'll definitely help you understand American culture. But you have to remember that these were not published in the 19th century. These were published starting in the 1930s, and the very last one actually... in the Little House canon, the very last one was published after both Laura and Rose had died. And this was published in 1971. So Little House on the Prairie, Little House in the Big Woods, which is the first one in the Little House canon, is 1932. So Depression era. You have to remember that. If you take nothing else away from this video, please remember that. These are not 19th century books. This is a Depression era interpretation of the mythology of the 19th century.
Right. At a minimum, written 50 years after the experiences that they're talking about. Right. Many of which are then mixed up within the books in terms of what era they actually happened in.
Right. And she was writing these to every elderly generation likes to point their finger at the younger generation as, you kids have it so easy these days. Back in my day, we had things so much rougher. Now she's telling this to kids living through the Great Depression. Now, how much do you have to exaggerate things to convince children living through the Great Depression that
they have it good?
They have it good. So please remember that when you go back and read through these books, because it's very important to understanding them and understanding why she wrote them why the two of these women wrote them the way they did.
Right.
And then Freeland and Let the Hurricane Roar, they're the same story as you get in the Little House books. It's just that the Little House books is the G version of the story, and those other two books are like the PG-13 version. But they're basically the same story. So, very, very interesting American canon. Very important to read.
Highly influential.
Highly influential.
Especially in 20th century and afterwards views of the 19th century.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, read them, but also remember to take a step back and think about the way in which they were written.
And then read those two biographies as well if
Absolutely.
you're curious about the making of these books and the people who created them.
Absolutely.
Because those are really important to understanding the context.
Right. And so Prairie Fires will give you the context of the history, which is very, very important. It gives you the background. It talks about the indigenous people that they were stealing land from at this point. In Little House on the Prairie, it makes no bones about it. They say, we're moving to Indian country. We're moving to Indian territory.
Right.
And they're very clear on that, which as a child I totally missed, but went back and read it as an adult and said, yeah, they were really blatant about this. They didn't sugarcoat it at all. So this author tells you about those indigenous tribes. She tells you about the economic depressions that were going on at this time, all of the deep history. The Ghost in the Little House, this one goes more into the biography of the biography of the two women, Rose Wilder Lane and Laura, and into the 20th century history of when these books were being written. So both of these books are really important to understand the full sweep of the series. Okay. Thank you for watching today. We hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a nice thumbs up, and remember to tell your friends about my books. Happy reading!